On the evening of February 24, 1986, the body of 29-year-old Sherri Rasmussen was discovered by her husband in their Los Angeles home. On that morning, John Rutten, Sherri's husband of only 3 months, left for work. Sherri, who worked as a nurse, had told him before he left that she might call in sick that day. While John was at work, he tried to call Sherri several times without getting an answer. Although this concerned him slightly, he just assumed that Sherri had decided to go to work after all. When John returned home that evening, he was surprised to see that their garage was open and that Sherri's BMW was missing. As he opened the front door and walked into their living room, he was met with a horrific sight. He found Sherri laying lifeless on the living room floor. Her face was badly beaten, and there was blood everywhere. John, who was in total shock, called 911 to report what he had just discovered. When police arrived, they quickly sealed off the crime scene and took John in for questioning. Police initially suspected John, but he was later cleared of any suspicion due to having an airtight alibi that he was at work all day that day, and this was backed up by his work colleagues. The crime scene showed signs that a struggle had taken place, due to a porcelain vase looking like it had been broken over Sherri's head, and also a bloody handprint on the wall right next to the burglar alarm's panic button. Sherri's autopsy showed that she had been shot 3 times in her chest by a .28 caliber firearm. It also discovered several defensive wounds on her body, along with a bite mark on her left arm that was swabbed for DNA. Police believe that Sherri had walked in on a robbery that day and that a struggle had ensued, resulting in the intruders shooting Sherri and stealing her car to get away from the crime scene. Sherri's car was found a week later, parked just a few miles from her home, but police didn't find any new evidence inside of the car. With no further leads, the case would eventually go cold, and for 29 years, Sherri's family were left with no answers. That was until 2009, when police finally reopened the case. The new investigators found it odd that the DNA evidence indicated that the suspect who bit Sherri's arm was a woman. Because of this, they believed the burglary theory to be wrong, and that they would have to start the investigation from the beginning. Investigators started to look into one of John Rutten's ex-girlfriends, Stephanie Lazarus, who was a LAPD detective. Her name did come up in the original investigation in 1986, but police dismissed her as a potential suspect. Lazarus had met John in 1972 while attending college. The two had dated on and off right up until John met Sherri. Stephanie was allegedly very envious of Sherri and had made it known on a few occasions. On one such occasion, Stephanie went to John and Sherri's home to tell Sherri that she had slept with John while they were engaged. When Sherri confronted John about this, he confessed to having slept with Stephanie once after their engagement, but Sherri forgave him and they both moved forward with their marriage. John claimed that he did mention to police in the days following the murder that Stephanie Lazarus was potentially someone they should look into. He says that police laughed him off and told him to stop watching so many detective shows. In 2019, detectives obtained a DNA sample from Stephanie by following her to a store and collecting a cup that she had discarded. They then sent it to a lab to be tested. The results of the tests were astounding. Stephanie's DNA was a direct match to the samples collected from the bite mark on Sherri's arm in 1986. Stephanie was arrested in June 2009. She claimed to have had nothing to do with the murder and got very angry when the finger was pointed at her. Detectives found a journal in her home with numerous mentions of her love for John and her despondence over his engagement to Sherri. In early 2012, Stephanie stood trial for the murder of Sherri Rasmussen. Prosecutors claimed that the motive for murder was her jealousy over John and Sherri's relationship. John Rutten would also testify at the trial. With this and the weight of the DNA evidence against her, Stephanie Lazarus was found guilty by a jury and sentenced to 27 years to life imprisonment in March 2012 for the murder of Sherri Rasmussen. It had taken 26 years for Sherri's family to get justice for her murder. The tragic case of 8-year-old Gretchen Harrington would take 5 decades to solve. On the morning of August 15, 1975, 8-year-old Gretchen Harrington would leave her home in Marple Township, Pennsylvania, to make the short walk to a Bible summer camp that she had been attending. The Bible camp was taking place at the Trinity Chapel Christian Reformed Church, a 9-minute walk from Gretchen's home. She usually made this walk with her 2 older sisters, but on that morning, their mother happened to be bringing home their newborn sister, and her 2 older siblings decided they wanted to stay home to greet them. Gretchen's plan that day was to go to the First Church led by Pastor David Zanstra, and then afterward go to another church close by where her own father, Harold Harrington, was the pastor. The children were all expected to arrive around 9 o'clock that morning to the First Church. Then they would be transported to the Second Church by Pastor David Zanstra. Gretchen's father, Pastor Harold Harrington, began to get very worried when Gretchen didn't arrive at the Second Church by 10:30. He started to search for Gretchen along the road she would have walked on the way to her first camp that morning. He then called the police at around 11:30 after Pastor David Zanstra's wife had informed him that they had not seen Gretchen at the Trinity Church that day. The police began to carry out a search for Gretchen and were joined by over 300 volunteers. But even with all the people searching for her over such a large area, no trace of Gretchen was discovered, and police called the search off after just 2 days. Police were baffled as to what had happened to her and had very little to go on. Then on October 13, 2 months after Gretchen's disappearance, a jogger in Ridley Creek State Park stumbled across human skeletal remains. Gretchen's parents confirmed the remains as their daughters by identifying the clothing she was wearing. Her autopsy found that she had died from blunt force trauma to her head and had a fractured skull. It also found no evidence of sexual assault, but police suspected that she may have been. Police began to question suspects in the area, some of which were known sex offenders, but nothing led to an arrest. The case eventually went cold, and it would stay that way for more than 40 years. Sometime in the fall of 2022, a woman called the Maple Township Police and left a message stating she wanted to talk about Gretchen's case. She told police that she was a childhood friend of Pastor David Zanstra's daughters and that he had improperly touched her on a few occasions. The woman had kept account of this in a diary, and it made police believe that the last time Zanstra had molested this girl was only 2 weeks before Gretchen's murder. When police confronted the now 84-year-old pastor about these claims, he shockingly admitted to have been the murderer of Gretchen Harrington in 1975. He told detectives that he had saw Gretchen walking alone that morning and offered her a ride. He then said he took her to a nearby wooded area and told her to take her clothes off. When she refused, he fatally punched her in the head. Pastor Zanstra then drove her body to the church and took the Bible camp classes as if nothing had happened. He disposed of her body a short time after. Pastor David Zanstra was arrested on July 17, 2023, and is still awaiting sentencing for the horrific crime and could well receive the death penalty. In a statement, the Harrington family said, "The abduction and murder of Gretchen has forever altered our family, and we miss her every single day." It had taken almost 50 years for Gretchen Harrington to receive the justice she deserves. In 1979, the city of Cedar Rapids in the state of Iowa was rocked by the callous murder of 18-year-old high school student Michelle Martinko. Michelle was born and raised in Cedar Rapids and was attending the Kennedy High School at the time of her killing. She was described as a very bright student who also had a love for performing arts, taking part in numerous school productions throughout her time there. Michelle had plans to attend the Iowa State University to study interior design after she had graduated from high school. On the evening of December 19, 1979, Michelle attended a banquet for her school choir at the Sheraton Inn in Cedar Rapids. When the banquet ended, she asked a few friends who also were at the event if they wanted to go shopping with her at the newly opened West Side Mall, where Michelle had recently started to work at. Both friends turned down her offer and Michelle decided to go alone, as she had been wanting to buy a new winter coat. When Michelle made it to the mall, she walked around for a while and spoke with a few people she worked with. The last sighting of Michelle was around 9 o'clock outside of a jewelry store in the mall. When Michelle hadn't returned home by 2 in the morning, her father reported her missing to police. He joined the police's search for her, and a few hours later, they found Michelle's 1972 Buick Electra in the northeast corner of the mall's parking lot. Inside the car, they found Michelle's lifeless body slumped over the passenger seat. Michelle had been stabbed a total of 29 times in her face, neck, and chest. She also had several defensive wounds, indicating that she had tried to fight off her attacker. Police quickly determined that she had been killed inside the car, due to the lack of blood on the outside. The medical examiner concluded that she had been killed sometime between 8 and 10 o'clock. The murder weapon was a sharp, pointed object, but the examiner couldn't definitively say that a knife was used. Police couldn't find any fingerprints on or around the car, leading them to believe the killer had worn gloves. Investigators found it difficult to establish a motive for the murder since her purse was untouched, and she was found fully clothed with no sign of sexual assault. Because of this and the location of her stab wounds, police believed the murder to be of a personal nature. Police didn't have many leads when they began their investigation and appealed to the public for information. Within a week, over 200 people had come forward. In response to this, detectives interviewed several people that were ruled out after passing a polygraph. The prime suspect in Michelle's murder was a man who had broken into a home in the Cedar Rapids area and assaulted a woman at knife point just a month before Martinko's murder. He was later ruled out through DNA evidence. 5 months after the murder, a woman would come forward with information to the daughter of the Secretary of the Public Safety Commissioner. This information was bizarrely never passed on to police. The woman stated that she drove past the mall's parking lot that night and noticed 2 cars, one of which she recognized as Michelle's. She saw a man standing next to the driver's side door of her car. In June 1980, police released a sketch of the man they believed to be Michelle's murderer. They obtained the description by putting 2 witnesses under hypnosis. The description was of a white man in his teens or early 20s, around 6 feet tall with brown eyes and brown curly hair. Despite police interviewing hundreds of people in relation to the murder and a $10,000 reward, the investigation went cold. It wasn't until 2006, a full 27 years after Michelle Martinko's murder, that the case would be blown wide open after an investigator received a tip-off about the murder. The tip didn't directly impact the case, but it led to the investigator finding what he thought to be the suspect's blood while reviewing the case files from the 70s. From this, police were able to build a partial DNA profile, but when the sample was entered into the National DNA Database, no match was found. Police then moved on to testing more than 80 potential suspects that had been identified over the years. From this, 60 people were tested and cleared of any suspicion. After this, the case would go cold again until 2017, when a company who specialized in DNA phenotyping generated images of the killer based on the DNA profile from 2006. The next year, in 2018, the same company were able to generate a family tree from the DNA using a public genealogy website. Through this, the police were able to narrow down the suspects to 3 brothers who grew up in nearby Manchester, Iowa. In October 2018, a detective was able to obtain the DNA from one of the brothers called Jerry Lynn Burns through a discarded drinking straw. When tested, the DNA came back as a match to blood found on Michelle Martinko's clothing. Burns was arrested on December 19, 2018, exactly 39 years since Michelle's murder. He denied having anything to do with the crime, but following a trial, he was convicted of the murder of Michelle Martinko and sentenced to life in prison on August 7, 2020. That would finally give Michelle's family the closure they had been wanting for 40 years.